So I understand that we are on Canto 3, Chapter 14, Text 34. Is that correct? Diti uvacha Name garbham imam brahman Name garbham imam brahman Bhutanam rishabho vadhit Bhutanam rishabho vadhit Rudrapatirhi Bhutanam Rudrapatirhi Bhutanam Yasyakaravam anghasam Yasyakaravam anghasam Diti uvacha Name garbham imam brahman Bhutanam rishabho vadit Rudrapatirhi Bhutanam Yasya karavam anghasam Dhitir uvacha Same garbham imam brahman Bhutanam rishabho vadhit Rudrapatirhi Bhutanam Yasyakaravam anghasam Ditir uvacha Name garbham imam brahman Bhutanam rishabho vadhit Rudrapatirhi Bhutanam Yasyakaravam anghasam Ditir uvacha Name garbham imam brahman Bhutanam rishabho vadhit Rudrapatirhi Bhutanam Yasya karavam amhasam Ditir uvacha Name garbham imam brahman Bhutanam rishabho vadhit Rudrapatirhi Bhutanam Yasyakaravam anghasam Vaishnavis Name garbham imam brahman Bhutanam rishabho vadhit Rudrapatirhi Bhutanam Yasyakaravam anghasam Ditir uvacha The beautiful Diti said Na, not Me, my Garbham, pregnancy Imam, this Brahman, O Brahmana Bhutanam, of all living entities Rishabha, the noblest of all living entities Avadhit, let him kill Rudraha, Lord Shiva Patihi, master He, certainly Bhutanam, of all living entities Yasya, whose Akaravam, I have done Anghasam, offense. So the translation reads, the beautiful Diti said, my dear Brahmana, kindly see that my embryo is not killed by Lord Shiva, the Lord of all living entities, because of the great offense I have committed against him. So, responsively, the beautiful Diti said, my dear Brahmana, kindly see that my embryo is not killed by Lord Shiva.
not killed by Lord Shiva,
the Lord of all living entities.
the Lord of all living entities,
Because of the great offense
because of the great offense
I have committed against him.
I have committed against him.
So here's Prabhupada's purport. Diti was conscious of her offense and was anxious to be excused by Lord Shiva. Lord Shiva has two popular names, Rudra and Ashutosh. He is very prone to anger as well as quickly pacified. Diti knew that because of his being quickly angered, he might spoil the pregnancy she had so unlawfully achieved. But because he was also Ashutosh, she implored her Brahmana husband to help her in pacifying Lord Shiva. For her husband was a great devotee of Lord Shiva. In other words, Lord Shiva might have been angry with Diti because she obliged her husband to transgress the law, but he would not refuse her husband's prayer. Therefore, the application for excuse was submitted through her husband. She prayed to Lord Shiva as follows. Diti uvacha name garbham imam brahman bhutanam urshabho vadhit rudrapatirhi bhutanam yasya karavam anghasam. The beautiful Diti said, "My dear Brahmana, kindly see that my embryo is not killed by Lord Shiva, the Lord of all living entities, because of the great offense I have committed against him." This verse is in the beginning sections of, it's actually still it's in the beginning section of the third part of this chapter. From verses 1 to 7 in chapter 14, third canto, we heard about Vidura asking about the fight of the Supreme Lord with Hiranyaksha. Then from 8 to 31, we're hearing about Diti's unfortunate desire. And then now we're in the third section, which is 32 to 51. There are only 3 sections in this chapter. And in this section, we hear about Kasyapa foretelling demoniac progeny from the union with his wife. So we've been talking around and around about a lot of different aspects of this whole episode. And of course, one of the main themes of this part of Srimad Bhagavatam is sex life and how it can easily impel people to action, and how at the same time, once they're impelled to action, then unfortunate consequences follow in the wake of unfortunate action. And this is a story as old as time, as old as the world, been told 1,000,000 times in 1,000,000 ways. Told by sages on the mountaintop, told by people in movies and popular songs. So this is not a very unknown or esoteric subject. Everybody knows well. And most of us know well not because of Bhagavatam, but because of the famous school of hard knocks that we learned about what happens when we don't control the senses. It's interesting here that the word bhutana is used, in 2 places in the verse. Diti refers to Shiva as Bhutana, which Prabhupada translates in one place as the Lord of the dull-headed, But he's also sometimes known as the Lord of the ghosts and hobgoblins and demons and such, So he's actually quite merciful to them, which is interesting. I find it kind of peculiar that Diti's worried that Shiva will destroy her embryo. But if the embryo is indeed demoniac, as foretold by Kasyap, then quite likely Lord Shiva would be friendly toward the embryo, because one of the things Lord Shiva does, he's known for, is the fact that he helps those in really, really bad karmic situations to make gradual progress. So that's why oftentimes demoniac are worshippers of Shiva. So they worship him because he provides various kinds of benedictions for them. We had stories being told not so long ago. A few days back, I think our Arjuna talked about Brikasura and about Lord Ramachandra. And, Ravana, he got a benediction from Shiva. And as a result, he wanted to conquer Ram. He wanted to take Ram's wife. And of course, it didn't turn out good for him. And not only, Prabhupada mentions in one purport that although Ravana had gotten a benediction from Shiva, when Ravana actually got into war with Ramachandra, Shiva didn't help him. He wasn't on his side. So this is the way it works. Of course, the story actually goes that, and I think Arjunananda mentioned a little bit about it, was that there was a big mountain and Lord Shiva and his wife Parvati were sitting on it, and proud of his power, this great demon Ravana, he wanted to lift the mountain and shake it, so he was doing it, and Parvati was a little afraid and Shiva was annoyed, and so Shiva pushed the mountain down with his foot, and it kind of squished Ravana, and he was crying out in pain. And actually that's what his name means, to cry out, So actually Lord Shiva's name, Rudra, also means that. So the same kind of etymology there. So he was being crushed by the mountain, and Lord Shiva's pushing down on it, and he began to offer these wonderful prayers to Shiva, and so therefore Shiva was pacified. Ashutosh, which means easily angered and easily pacified or easily pleased. So Lord Shiva was angered and annoyed by the antics of Ravana. But then immediately afterwards, when Ravana offered him glowing prayers, then Shiva released him, and he got some benedictions, and he thought that this would make him invincible. But nobody's invincible except the Supreme Lord. So it didn't work out good for Ravana. Of course, Vrikasura, as also Arjunananda mentioned, he was also very ungrateful and very nasty demon, that he begged to get a benediction from Shiva. He was actually cutting off parts of his body and putting them in a sacrifice. There's no such sacrifice, in case you were wondering, listed anywhere in the Vedas, but he made this idea up So he was cutting off pieces of his own flesh and throwing them into the fire, ostensibly to please Lord Shiva so he could get a benediction. And Lord Shiva wasn't coming. So Mrigasura became agitated and decided he would cut off his own head and put it in the fire. And just before he could cut off his own head, Lord Shiva appeared and said, "Stop." And so then Mrigasura asked him for a benediction. He got the benediction that whoever's head he touched, it would crack into 1,000 pieces. And of course, that's the whole story too. So Ashutosh and Bhutanat. So Lord Shiva is helping the various living entities. In the next canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, in Canto 4, we're going to hear about the war between Daksha and Shiva. Because, of course, we will find out that Daksha, because of his pride, looks upon Lord Shiva as a subordinate. And he talks very nasty to Lord Shiva. And this is absorbed and tolerated by Lord Shiva. Lord Shiva doesn't mind. But later on, his wife wants to go to, his wife is Sati, so she wants to go to her father's home. They're having a big festival there, but Shiva knows that he's not invited. And so he cautions Sati not to go. A similar episode to this one that we're talking about here, that Kasyap cautioned his wife that it would be bad for her if they had sex at an inopportune time while Lord Shiva was transversing with all of his ghostly followers. And in a similar way, Lord Shiva will tell his wife, Sati, that it would be better if she didn't go to her father's house, because he knew that her father was envious of him, of Shiva, and therefore there could be a chance that he would make some offense. In fact, that's exactly what happens. That when Sati goes to her father's home, her father completely neglects Shiva and says nasty things about him. And then, as a result, Sati is angered so much that she's disgusted that she has a family tie with Daksha, and she causes mystic fire to consume her own body, and she disappears. Of course, we find out that later on, she reincarnates as the daughter of the Himalayas, and that's where the name Parvata means mountain. So she becomes Parvati in this way. She again becomes a consort of Lord Shiva, but not as the daughter of Daksha. She's in another family now. So that happens later on. But at any rate, we see that Lord Shiva is actually very generous. But Diti is afraid that she's incurred his wrath, so she's asking her kind husband to please intercede in case Shiva would do something to harm the embryo. But in a few more verses we're going to find out that Kasyapa will give the foretelling that this embryo will be very inauspicious. And actually, there'll be two children. There will be Hiranyaksha and Hiranyakashipu, both of whom will be great demons. But because he sees that Diti is sorry for what she's done, then he says, but there'll be a benediction. And that benediction is, although her two children will be demons, her one grandchild will be actually a great devotee, and of course that's Prahlad. So, of course, what we really want to know in this kind of an episode is how to be free from sex life. That's actually our real question that we want to have answered, the $64 million question, Everywhere people are trapped into unfortunate situations by sex life. We were mentioning it in the beginning. So how do we get free from it? Well, there's a number of different verses, and there's a number of different techniques or angles that we can approach this concept with. And, I thought probably the first one we could discuss comes to us from the Nectar of Instruction, Vacho Vegam, Manasa Kroda Vega, Jiva Vega, Udarapasta Vega, and Etan Vega, and Yo Vishaheta Dira, Sarvam Apimam Pritivim Sasisyat. That the pushings of the tongue, belly, genitals, anger, mind, and words, anyone who can control these 6 pushings is suitable to be a spiritual master of the world. So, and then in the purport, it's an interesting purport if you read it, that Prabhupada mentions a lot of different things. One of the things Prabhupada mentions in this purport is that the tongue, belly, and genitals are situated in a straight line. So if one can control the tongue, then one will have not much trouble controlling the belly, and then one will therefore also control the genitals. So this is a part, not only control the tongue in the sense of eating, but also in the sense of speaking. Because if we speak in the wrong way, then we will create a situation that will draw undesired sex activity towards us. In fact, probably the biggest battle that any human being faces is the battle to control sex desire. So if we speak about sex in the wrong way, if we speak to people in the wrong way, we'll be talking about offenses in a minute. That's another important angle to becoming free from sex life. If we speak offenses, then we will draw sex activity towards us. So being careful, and controlling the tongue, then one can control the belly and the genitals. This is, of course, easier said than done. But as our, what was his name? Devotee that spoke a couple of days ago on, what was it? Chaitanya Charan, yeah. He was mentioning that that as you try to control the senses, you may have a lot of trouble at first. And I think everybody does. But if you continue and you stay with it, eventually the senses will become more and more controlled. Because by controlling the senses, one actually conquers the material world. So Krishna consciousness is sometimes described as a process of purification. It's sometimes described as a process of connecting with the Supreme Lord. It's sometimes described as a process of controlling the mind. It's sometimes described as a process of controlling the senses. It's sometimes described as a process of rising in the modes of nature. All these things are essentially the same thing, but just seen from somewhat of a different perspective. Because if you succeed at any one of them, you will succeed at all of them at the same time. If you control the mind, it's the same as focusing on the Supreme Lord. If you focus on the Supreme Lord, it's the same as controlling the mind. If you rise in the 3 modes of nature, it's the same as being purified. All these things are the same. If you control your desire, then essentially you will control your mind and senses. So all these things are interrelated. And we know that controlling the senses is difficult, but if one stays with it, the analogy has also been given the last few days of the horse, the 5 horses and the reins and the chariot and the driver, that if we stay with trying to control the horses with the reins, all of us have to do this, whether you're a man or a woman or whatever, you have to try to stay with controlling the mind. If you can control the mind, the senses are automatically controlled, because the mind is the thing that goes out to the senses. The senses are locking on like some kind of smart weapon, locking on to various sense objects in the outside world. And the little target forms, and like the fighter jets, lock on target, so the senses lock on to a particular target, and the mind then thinks, oh, look at that, on my control panel here, suddenly a red light has come on and we've locked on to this sense object over here. It's pulsating, and we're thinking about it, and then we're judging what magnitude this particular sense object is, and desirability. Oh, it's a magnitude 8. Wow, that's pretty good, And then something else comes on over here, smaller. That's a magnitude 2, so we're definitely going for the magnitude 8, sense object. And the mind is then veering over to one of these different things. Usually the mind goes to the thing of the greatest sense magnitude of pleasure, according to our sensibilities. For many lifetimes, we have cultivated certain kinds of tastes or rasas. We have a proclivity or a desire for certain kinds of sense gratification. Some people don't have the kinds of desires for the same sense gratification we do, and vice versa. We don't have the kind of desire for sense gratification that they do. So we culture these things, and then because we have a certain pattern, as at death, we get attracted to a particular womb. And so, there's this verse, yam yam vapi smaran bhavam tyajante ante kalevaram, so the soul encased in the subtle body at the point of death is attracted to another body somewhere, and that's according to the laws of karma. And just as because we had a certain desire and we had a certain karma, both those things have bearing on what kind of body we get. We are diverted to a new body in another place somewhere. And similarly, this is the flip side of it, the male and female attracting that body their consciousness attracts a particular kind of body too. So our consciousness is being attracted to a womb, and that womb is the womb that the husband and wife are, because of their mentality during coitus, they're attracting a particular kind of being there. So it works out that way in a very scientific way. So that's why there's the process of Garbhadan Sanskar, where the husband and wife do a lot of purification before the act of procreation, so that they won't attract a negative or a very materialistic being to the womb, which is what exactly is happening here. Because of the nature of the unfortunate, sudden, and unscheduled sex activity at the wrong, inappropriate time, then instead of Diti attracting a nice child, as one might think, Diti's a demigoddess, and Lord And Kasyapa is a great sage, so one would think they would have a good child, but because of the wrong kind of mentality, then instead they have a demoniac child. And we see this sometimes works in reverse, like where Hiranyakashipu and his wife, Kayadu, they have a child that's actually saintly, even though they're demoniac. So demoniac people attract a saintly child to their womb, and of course there's a story about that, that Hiranyakashipu was hearing, I think Narada Muni in the form of a bird chanting Krishna, Krishna, and he was disturbed by that, but he couldn't get it out of his head. So that was what was happening during the time when he was approaching his wife. So inadvertently, as a result, he attracted a saintly child to the womb. So this is kind of interesting how this works sometimes. So at any rate, we see that we have to control the mind. And actually that's one of the most important things. In Bhagavad Gita we see that in chapter 3, starting with verse 36, we have Arjuna asking the age-old question, why is it that someone is compelled to sinful acts, even against their own will, So Arjuna says, O descendant of Vrishni, by what is one impelled to sinful acts, even unwillingly, as if engaged by force? Now, we generally think we have free will, and to a large extent we do. But when one misuses free will again and again, gradually one relinquishes free will, and one becomes almost like an animal or a robot, that this is how people get to the point where they are helpless in doing sinful acts. They can't control themselves at all, because gradually, they have given up their ability to control themselves by engaging in sinful acts. And after a while, sinful action is automatic. It there's no question that if the opportunity arises, that the person who has given up their free will through bad habit will immediately engage in whatever opportune sinful activity presents itself at that moment. So and Krishna explains in chapter 3 that kama esha, krodha esha. So it is because the Supreme Personality of God said is lust only, Arjuna, which is born of contact with the material mode of passion, and later transformed into wrath, which is the all-devouring sinful enemy of this world. So why do we act against our own best interest, even knowing that we're doing something that's wrong, even knowing that we will suffer? We still do it. And the answer is because the mode of passion is strong, and because of that we are dragged helplessly like a man walking in a hurricane, being blown in a particular direction. So this is why we say that controlling the senses is the same as rising in the modes of nature, because in the modes of passion one is kicked around, blown around by the mode of passion. And in the mode of goodness one is not blown around so much by the mode of passion. One has the ability to resist. But if one does not engage in any purification, then quite likely that the winds of passion will have their way, and we will be blown into some activity that we will later regret. So also this is described in the second chapter of Bhagavad Gita. I think it's 64 or somewhere like that, Dhyayato vishayam pumsam sangas teshu pajayate sangat sanjayate kama krodho vijayate krodho bhavati samohat smriti vibramaha smriti brahmashad buddhinasha pranashyati. From contemplating, now this is the important part to remember, contemplating objects of the senses, one develops what? Attachment. From attachment, what? Lust. From lust, what? Anger, krodha. From anger, what? Delusion, samoha. From delusion, then bewilderment of memory. And when memory is bewildered, intelligence is lost, and one falls down into the material pool. Now, this is like a medical etiology, that if you contemplate, you'll become attracted. From attraction, you'll get lust. From lust, you'll get anger. This is a gradual staircase or a cause and effect relationship. And if you catch it early on, it's a lot easier to deal with than when you catch it later on. The later stages are much more sticky, gooey, and like quicksand and hard to get out of. The earlier versions are much easier. That's why if you can control the mind, you can miss so many unfortunate events in your life. So the mind is like the rudder in a ship. The way it's facing is the way the ship will ply. So we know, as we've been hearing lately in several of the classes, that if you focus the mind on something, then that will direct your whole life. Most people don't know what to focus their mind on, so naturally they focus on various sense objects, and sense objects do one thing, and sense objects engage in sense enjoyment. And when we engage in sense enjoyment, we all know the smoking more, enjoying it less principle, that the more you do of some kind of material enjoyment, it becomes less and less pleasurable, and one has to do it to a greater and greater extent. And as one becomes purchased by various kinds of sense enjoyment, then eventually one finds that they develop a taste for darker and darker things, because darker and darker things have the real punch of sense gratification to them, So this is how one gradually goes down the great sink drain hole of material life, like the little spider or bug caught in a whirlpool as we pull the plug out from a bathtub or a sink somewhere. It's whirlpool's going down, and the little bug just goes down on in there, and it's terrifying. So this is why we try to control the senses. We know that this will happen to anyone who does not make any effort to pull back on the senses. And people have known this for ages, and not just people who are Krishna devotees, not just people who are even religious, but even regular people can understand that the more you give in to the senses, the more you kind of degrade yourself. And the Greeks talked a lot about this concept that one has to control the passions, But if we can do that, then so much is averted. But controlling the mind is a tricky business, Actually, this is one thing we work at every day when we're chanting japa. We're chanting japa, and naturally the mind is immediately rebels, You know, that's the way the mind is. The minute you start chanting japa, the mind says, "Oh man, he's doing that again." You know, what about this? Hey, you know, here's we got to do this. What's going to happen in 2 hours? What kind of prasadam are they going to have later on? What about what that person said yesterday? Yeah, they shouldn't have said that. You know, that I didn't like that. You know, and the mind, you know, is reminiscing, it's planning, it's agitated. Sometimes it goes on a complete maniacal, focus on something, you know, and as a result, we get swept up in some kind of thing. And the next thing we know, wow, I've chanted 10 rounds and I don't remember a single thing about any of those rounds. You know, we're dealing with as I'm thinking about it, a transparent, odorless, and tasteless thing, you know, the mind and what it focuses on. When something is visual, we can usually deal with it well, you know. But this is all sound and feeling and nothing else, you know, in chanting. And we're trying to stay like, you know, a person learning to ride a bicycle. We're trying to stay on top of it and not fall off, you know. And if you pray and you work at it, you'll discover that over time you're able to stay focused more and stay spaced out less, you know. And the hardest part is to pay attention to the fact that you're not paying attention. Because we are ignorant of the fact that we're ignorant. We are spaced out to the fact that we're spaced out. You know, we're so far off that we don't even know we're off until, you know, the whole japa's over, and then we think, oh well, maybe, you know. And this is a battle that you won't win once and for all. It's the battle that we face every day, and you're going to face it every day. It does get easier if you start to, make some headway and apply yourself. But it's easy just to think that, you know, we've got all this important service to do, and, you know, we've got all this and that and the other, and this is going to be happening, et cetera, et cetera. But if we can increase the quality of our chanting, then so much comes from that, you know. It's really, you know, as Prabhupada said, 90% of our progress in spiritual life. And the tough part is we never learn this in school, you know. We learn maybe, you know, how to make figures. We learned, you know, the multiplication tables. We learned ABCs, or maybe some other character group. We learned how, you know, sociology works. We learned about the politics of our country. We learned about science and how to mix atoms of hydrogen and oxygen together to make water. But we never learned how to control our mind. And nobody even suggested such a thing to us. What to speak of gave us any actual tangible process for how to do it, you know. So focusing the mind is, especially when you just start chanting, if you can just get in the mode, or get in the, what do they call it, in the zone right from the very beginning, you can usually keep it up. It's much easier. But if you start off already kind of, woozy and wazy, you know, then you'll have trouble kind of getting in the zone, although it is possible still from making a bad start. But when we actually can control the mind chanting japa, then we learn that when our mind is presenting crazy things to us. Senses lock on. The meter says this is a good strong 8 in the a desirability category. Then we think we just later on it, we just let it pass by and we move on to something else. And it's surprising how if you can just see a thought come and let it go, that if you can develop that habit, especially with material sense desires, then you'll find that life becomes so much different. You can miss so much garbage in life by just controlling the mind. Especially, this is one of the main parts to controlling sex life. There's more I wanted to say, but I have to at least do a few seconds of discussion on the idea of offenses, because this is what's mentioned in the Harinam Chintamani, that there are 10 offenses against the chanting of the holy name. And of course, the first offense is to blaspheme the devotees who've dedicated their lives for propagating the holy name of the Lord. So this is where mostly, I think, people go wrong, and they veer off the beam and get into being dragged down by sex life. Because when one offends devotees, then Krishna removes the protection one has and the taste one has for devotional service. And when that happens, it's natural that we need taste somewhere. So we get it from, the material world, usually in the grossest and most unpleasant sort of way. So this is why we are very careful about making offenses, and we're controlling the mind. So any rate, since it's late, I usually wanted to go ahead. We'll ask a few questions, and hopefully there'll be a little bit of indulgence if we go over time a bit.
Hare Krishna. Is it necessarily more difficult for people who have more kind of tamasic desires to get purified in comparison to people who are more influenced by Rajas and Sattva?
What was the first part of the question?
Is it necessarily more difficult for people who are more in the lower modes, like tamas, who have developed tamasic desires, to get purified and get to a stable platform?
Yeah.
In comparison to,
it's we know that if you're in a submarine and you're down the bottom of the ocean, it's going to take you longer to get to the top. Yeah. And then if you're halfway, however, the determination or the intensity with which one engages in devotional service actually trumps that. That if somebody is very serious about engaging in devotional service, they can rise sometimes faster than somebody who's actually closer to the surface, but more lukewarm about their, progress in spiritual life. So both things are there, and that's why if we can just somehow get a sense of urgency or intensity or focus about doing devotional service, then we will rise very quickly, no matter how far down we are. We have the story of Mrigari the hunter, someone who's really down there in the modes of nature. Because of his association with, Narada Muni, he changed his life, and very quickly he rose. Of course, Jagai and Madai too, they were great debauchees. But because they were saved by Lord Chaitanya and Nityananda, then they actually became great devotees, and they made, but, most of us are neither way, way down there or way, way up there. So we're somewhere in between. And when we get the opportunity, we tend to rise kind of very slowly. But it doesn't have to be that way. It just usually is that way. Chaitanya.
On this point of practicing seriously, sometimes I hear that, some devotees may say, we don't want to go too hard in devotional service because we'll get burned out. So how do we, because we know the more devotional service we practice attentively and without offense, the more of a taste we'll get, the more purified we'll become. So how is it that one burns out? How does that happen?
Yeah. Well, usually when a person burns out, I think that's what you're talking about, right? Is because they engaged in austerities that were not necessarily suitable for them, as opposed to trying to focus the mind. The greatest austerity is trying to focus the mind, but I've yet to hear any case where anybody called emergency services for somebody who was trying too hard to control the mind. Usually it's not physically damaging, but somebody who's doing maybe too much physical or too much eating or too much not eating or too much not sleeping or something like that, then that can definitely push you over the edge if you don't have a sense of how far to go with it, But the real austerity is trying to constantly stay on top of the mind. It's not physically difficult because there's no muscles being pulled and you're not straining the body in any particular way. The one thing you're straining is the false ego, and that screams louder than anything else, So that's where the difficulty is. But if you can stay with it, that I keep telling myself that if I can just hear this holy name, I won't have to get run over by a bus or something like that to get purified. It's the easy way to get purified, as opposed to the school of hard knocks that all of us love and study in, where we learn what not to do by getting whacked over the head, But if you can just keep the mind, and Krishna will appreciate it, and by chanting the holy name, you'll become purified, and your progress in spiritual life will be kind of like, at least in general, an upward trend. You won't get in the zigzag stuff, that happens when we may be performing some austerity, but it's not really austerities in the physical sense that do it for us. It's controlling of the mind more than anything else. Yes.
Just wanted to appreciate Maharaj, the analogy you gave of the chanting good japas like riding a bicycle. Right. Pay attention, or else stay on top of it, or don't fall off.
Getting in the zones.
Yeah.
And I think Satyananda Swami talks about that. He has all these courses of how to immerse yourself in the name. I've been to some of them. Some of his techniques seem to resonate with me, others not, but you can kind of explore various, because we're dealing with something that we don't have any vocabulary for, and there's no comfortable, easy to grab metaphors either, so you have to make up the metaphors, What are we dealing with? We're dealing with a colorless, odorless thing controlling the mind. So how do you talk about that? So you have to use these metaphors and analogies, and but actually it's there, that we're trying to, keep bringing the mind back, and we're trying to focus. And sometimes it's like riding a bicycle, or a lot of other things that you can use.
And then I had a question, Maharaj, I guess, just to finish it off. When devotees might have a fall down, specifically sexually, we've been talking a lot about this is sex, what is the rectification, and how should other devotees respond, or try to help maybe these devotees? Because we know, at least I understand, is if anything goes wrong, what do? You try to take shelter of Krishna. But then if the devotees are also rejecting you, what do you do?
Right, definitely. We should, as Radha Swami always says, hate the sin and not the sinner. And at the same time, we can understand that it could have been me. You just never know. Something can come out of the blue, and suddenly. It mentions in the Harinam Chintamani, which I wanted to talk about, but I didn't get a chance to get into it. I'll just mention it very quickly, and that is that if one criticizes a devotee because of their caste, this is what it says in the Harinam Chintamani, because of previous sins prior to becoming a devotee, because of sinful tendencies that are yet not completely expunged, or from accidental fall down that was unpremeditated, then one commits the sin of namnad balad hi papabudi, I think is how that offense goes to, making offending the Vaishnavas who've dedicated their lives. So this is the four categories that they meant. If one derides a devotee because of his caste or his birth, one derides a devotee because of unpremeditated fall down, if one derides a devotee because of remnants of sinful qualities that still remain, and these are the ways that one actually makes a mistake and incurs the sin of offending Vaishnavas. Okay, so we're getting beyond time, so I thank you all very much for your kind attention. All glories to Srimad Bhagavatam, all glories to the Vaishnava devotees of the Lord. Hare Krishna.